Hello everyone, my name is Jade Tonos. I am currently a postdoc in Dr. Onsa Rasafindratsima's lab at UC Berkeley, and today I'm going to be going over the results of an exciting new study that is currently under review titled Impacts of Lemur Extinction, the Loss of Large-Bodied Generalist Lemurs Threatens Plant Communities. So as most of us know, biotic interactions are super important. So biotic interactions like seed dispersal by animals are fundamental to the reproduction and survival of many plant species, and therefore are fundamental to the healthy functioning of ecosystems. Now, sucuri, which is the consumption of whole fruits by an animal and the subsequent dispersal of the consumed seeds, plays a fundamental role in shaping the diversity, structure, composition, and spatial arrangement of plant communities, and thus influences the ability of plant population to escape environmental change. Unfortunately, as anthropogenic pressures on natural systems increase, seed dispersal is at high risk of disruption. Anthropogenic activities such as hunting, logging, fires place frugivores at a higher risk, and if these species are lost and there's no other animal species that can fill the functional gap left by the species that was lost, plant species may essentially become the living dead, with the long-term outlook being local or even global extinction. Now, these impacts could be even more pronounced for isolated insular systems where plant species may depend on a small subset of animal frugivores for seed dispersal with very limited redundancy. This is actually the case on the island of Madagascar, where the majority of its diverse flora have traits adapted for seed dispersal by a very limited community of frugivorous vertebrates, the lemurs. The situation gets a little worse when we consider the fact that these very important frugivores and seed dispersals in Madagascar are severely threatened. More than 90% of the lemur species in Madagascar are actually threatened with extinction. Now, as we look for management solutions to this issue and try to understand how these ecosystems might change and survive in the future, we are of course very interested in understanding how plant-lemur interactions may change in the face of lemur extinction. And for this study, we are very specifically interested in examining which plant species might be most vulnerable to the loss of critically endangered lemur species. We want to examine if the loss of critically endangered lemur species are more likely to affect closely related plant species, like are we going to see a specific clade or genus be put at risk by the loss of these lemurs? And we also want to understand how the loss of these endangered lemur species can change the structure and strength of plant frugivore networks. And so what we did is we used a data set of trophic interactions between plants and lemurs encompassing the entire island of Madagascar. This data set included 1,687 plant species, as well as 153 species which are unknown to Western science, but identified unknown by a local name. And we also included 59 lemur species from 73 different locations, spanning a broad geographic range of different ecosystems. We then used this data set to generate a network of plant-lemur frugivorous interactions. In this network, lemurs are connected to any plant species from which they are known to consume fruit. We use this network to try to understand how the interactions might change in the face of lemur extinction. But first, we looked at some general descriptors of these interactions. I'm going to very quickly go through the highlights of our results. So firstly, we found when looking at what kind of plants lemurs were eating, that they were primarily focusing on endemic species. We also found that when looking at all types of interactions, and this included folivory, for example, lemurs generally consumed plants that were more closely related than expected by chance. And this was particularly the case with frugivorous interactions. And finally, we found that closely related lemurs consumed similar sets of plants. These results hint at the close evolutionary history between plants and lemurs on the island and may indicate some constraints in plant-lemur interactions that might place plants at risk if their evolutionary partners are lost. After this initial examination of our data, we also used our network to extract some general information on the structure of the interactions. First, we found, as is the case with most mutualistic networks, that these interactions are significantly nested. As shown in this diagram of plant-animal interactions, that means that the species with which specialist lemurs interact are a subset of the species that interact with generalist lemurs. This kind of nestedness can really contribute to network stability, as it indicates that there's a high level of redundancy in dispersal services. We also found that the network was significantly modular, indicating that interactions are clustered in subgroups that interact with each other more often than they do with other parts of the network. This makes sense when considering what we know about phylogenetic patterns in these interactions. As closely related lemurs interact with a similar subset of plants and vice versa, they can create these clusters. We then examined the roles that individual lemur species were playing within this modular structure. So here in this graph, we have each one of these points is a lemur species. On the x-axis, we have how well connected it is inside its module. On the y-axis, we have how well connected it is outside its module. This kind of allows us to get a handle on the different roles played by different lemur species. We first found that most lemur species played a peripheral role, being primarily connected within their module or subgroup, but not really playing a prominent role either within or between. We found that a smaller portion of plants served as lemurs served as connectors, primarily connecting different subgroups to each other. So they were forming a bridge between two clusters of interactions that otherwise weren't very well connected to each other. And then in the end, we found only 2 lemur species that served as module hubs. So module hubs are species that contribute substantially to the structure of their module. So within their module, they're really, really highly connected. These 2 species were lemur cata, the ring-tailed lemur, and the red-bellied lemur. This indicates that these lemurs play a very important role within the structure of this network, and their loss could really affect how everything is structured and connected. So in order to understand the effects of losing critically endangered lemurs, we then examined changes to the interaction network when these species are lost, with the assumption that any plant that interacts solely with a now extinct critical lemur will also go extinct. We found that the loss of critically endangered lemur species is likely to impact a total of 164 plant species. These plant species are those that would be left orphaned by the extinction of their frugivorous partners, and these plants were primarily endemic and resided in the humid forests of Madagascar. We also found that the loss of these critically endangered species changed the structure of the network by increasing the degree of nestedness. Even when removing a single lemur at a time, we saw this increase in nestedness, which could be good because higher nestedness, as I said earlier, might result in higher stability of the remaining network. This was not the case with one single species, the black and white ruffed lemur. When that lemur is removed, nestedness tends to decrease, which makes sense because Varisha is a generalist species and it probably interacts with a broad amount of different plant species and contributes to that nested structure. So once that lemur disappears, nestedness decreases, and we might see a loss in some redundancy in this network. So finally, we looked at the phylogenetic relatedness of the plant assemblages that may be affected if with the absence of each one of the critical lemurs. We actually found no significant pattern in the relatedness of these plant species, though overall, the loss of critical lemur species did not disproportionately affect any particular plant clade. There were certain exceptions. So specifically, we saw that the loss of the loss of the Varroa and the loss of the red-ruffed lemur could affect plant species that are more closely related than expected by chance. To further examine how these networks may change, we then looked at the robustness of the network to the loss of lemur species according to their endangered status, their size, and the number of plants they interacted with. The following graphs will show our results, showing on the x-axis the number of lemur species lost at that point, and on the y-axis the number of plant species remaining following these lemur extinctions. So for each scenario, there will be 2 graphs side by side showing loss of lemurs according to a category such as endangered status, from highest to lowest endangered status, and then from lowest to highest. Here, when removing lemur species from highest endangered status to lowest endangered status and vice versa, we see similarly smooth curves that represent plant decline. This smooth curve and the fact that they're matched on both sides indicates the network is robust to the loss of highly threatened lemurs. This story changes when we remove species according to the number of plant interactions they have and with their body size. When removing from largest and best connected, we see a quick decline in plant diversity that is not seen when we remove starting from the smallest and least connected lemurs. This indicates that large-bodied and generalist lemur species are particularly important to the stability of the network. This kind of mirrors what we found in network structure when critical species were lost. In general, critical species loss resulted in higher nestedness, which might indicate higher stability, but when a large-bodied and highly generalist species is removed, the black and white ruffed lemur, like we discussed earlier, nestedness actually decreased, potentially leading to lower redundancy and thus this lack of robustness against their loss that we see here. And so, in conclusion to our study, and to our first question, we found that the plants most likely to be lost are plants that are endemic to Madagascar and that reside in the humid forests. We did not find that the loss of critical species would affect particularly closely related plant groups. And finally, we found that critically endangered species increased the modularity and nestedness of the network, though the network was fairly robust to the loss of these critically endangered species. In the end, it appears that while critically endangered species altered the structure of the interaction network, the network was least robust against the loss of generalist or large-bodied lemur species. Though endangerment status was not a factor across the board, large-bodied species tended to be the most threatened in every habitat. When you look at the details of which species are at most risk in different habitats across Madagascar, often the largest bodied, generally species crop up first as the most threatened. And finally, this work really relies on data from well-studied lemur species. And though large-bodied species appear really important, we are very likely lacking a lot of information, specifically on small-bodied and nocturnal lemurs. So while we can highlight the importance of large-bodied generalists, we really can't downplay the importance of these other species that are not as well studied. And with that, I would be very happy to take any questions.